We're all here to celebrate the brand new, is it actually officially out? The officially published book by my colleague from Sociology, Colin Jerolmack. It's called The Global Pigeon. I had the pleasure of being on a small group about 2 years ago that got to see an early draft of this, and
I'm sorry.
we savored it, but we also tore it apart, and I haven't seen how it's been put back together again, but it's been put back together at least beautifully. And the concept for tonight is we're really here to celebrate, but because we're also a university, like we celebrate kind of critically, so we're going to give them a bit of a hard time, not just like a hazing, but intellectually fun hard time. And to do that, we have Harvey Molotch from the Department of Sociology and Metropolitan Studies, who's going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. And we asked Harvey to give the book talk that Colin might otherwise give, so that Colin can just riff on his own and spend his time entertaining us with stories about pigeons. We're not going to stay in this room for too long, maybe 30 or 40 minutes, because I want to make sure that we can all have a toast afterwards and remind you that we actually have copies of the book here for sale. So it wouldn't be a book party if you didn't buy a copy of the book and have Colin sign it. I know he'd enjoy that. So please help me in welcoming Harvey and Colin, and let's give Colin a round of applause.
Great. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to stand because I've sat in that very far back and struggled with the fact that I couldn't see what was going on. So I'm going to stand up. So first of all, this book, it's called The Global Pigeon. It's global, but it's really not about pigeon. So what is it about? It's about animals, but it's about all kinds of animals. It's about pigeons, yes, included. And quite heavily, but it's also about human beings. It's about those two, at least, two different types of animals. And on the non-humans, I think a big point that Colin is making is that these creatures are not alone. They are hybrids. I don't know why I'm getting feedback. How's this? Yeah, this is good. This is good. It's about the non-humans, and the non-humans in the book include pigeons. And the big point of the book is that they are hybrid. What does hybrid mean? It means they live on our ledges and rejoice in our garbage and exist through our existence. They are completely adapted to us. Now, that's what's remarkable about pigeons. They're extreme in that regard and extremely evident that that's what's going on. But in a larger sense, they are indicative of the rest of what is going on in the living world, which is that they exist by virtue of their interaction with human beings and with civilization. So that's one of the interesting things about them. Dogs have been bred to be what they are. They are completely artificial creatures, no less so than pigeons. And rats, of course, are divine creatures of New York and many other parts of the world. What Colin does is follow one particular creature, which is he follows the pigeons. He does a remarkable thing with the pigeons. The pigeons are it's a sample. It's a pigeon sample. The way that Colin finds the human beings and the human situations that he wants to examine as a sociologist is to basically follow the pigeon. And this sampling technique has some advantages to it. Many times our samples are in a way pre-organized through our stereotypes, either sociological or otherwise. And so a way to examine race and gender and so forth is to choose ahead of time, as it were, who they will be, how many there will be of each variety, and how that will operate. Something that randomizes, in a way, the sample is to follow a creature that has not prior been classified sociologically, and the pigeon fits the bill. And that gives us, I think, an orientation toward human beings and the way they operate by race, by class, by gender, how they're engaged in social movements, how they have moral sentiments, how they intersect with government, commerce, and authority structures in ways that are not preordained at all. They're radically open when the pigeon is what you're following into all of these different sectors. So it's a sampling device. And it's a way to then find the human in all of these different varieties. Concretely, he goes to Greenwich Village, not so far away. This was not a dramatic move afoot, and finds people feeding pigeons, something we see all over New York, this neighborhood in particular, as well as others. He also follows the pigeons to Trafalgar Square, to Piazza San Marco. He sees that people are engaged with pigeons for their what looks like amusement. They play a role in tourism. They help children have adventures. There are various kinds of human life in which those pigeons are in interaction in those kinds of places. The pigeons also play a role in things like bonding among human beings. And so when he's studying pigeon racers and pigeon breeders on the roofs in Brooklyn and in the Bronx in New York, or among the Turks in Berlin, he's finding other kinds of functions and modalities that the pigeons are involved with. Similarly, when he goes to South Africa, which is still another of his chapters, and he sees that there are commercially organized races in which the top prize is $1 million. So he goes from working class neighborhoods in the Bronx and Brooklyn to a place in South Africa where the elites in a highly organized environment engage in competition with proxy pigeons who race with top prizes of $1 million. And it's a kind of high society organization in, I think, Johannesburg, if I recall it correctly. Well, as you're probably gathering, this book is about the interaction between human beings and nature, between civilization and the wild. But the word interaction doesn't do it justice because it isn't just one creature talking to or shooing or feeding another creature, but it's about the ways in which these two kinds of being, the beings of civilization and the beings of the wild, are in fact constituting one another through very concrete practices that Colin takes us through. Now, how do we understand this constant or this continuing interaction in which both are constituted through that interaction? Well, one springboard that is often referred to is biophilia. That is that human beings, despite our civilization, or maybe even because of it, have a kind of deep, hardwired, perhaps, need to get back to the roots and to be in contact with nature. Colin destroys that. And it is because of the fact that it is anything but biophilia. I shouldn't say anything but. That is certainly a very incomplete story of how it actually works. It works through the social bonds that human beings have with one another, the way in which these creatures operate to facilitate bonding among men on the roofs, facilitate high society social events in South Africa, the way people watch each other feed pigeons in the park. All of these things are going on to constitute the relationship between these two, what look like extremely different forces in the world. It's akin to, for those of you who are familiar with it, the research in anthropology and material culture studies of Mary Douglas, Daniel Miller, in which they take up the subject of physical objects, ordinary dead objects in the world, and show that in acts of consumption, we are actually engaged in acts of solidarity and acts of social distinction, and all the whole repertoire of human beings in their lived existence, except that these are indeed alive creatures. And that then introduces a new dimension beyond the kinds of things that the material culture studies people take up. Because pigeons, like all the other creatures, are unpredictable in certain ways. There's a wildness about them. And Colin uses the word, they are uncanny. They are uncanny. And this interaction between the social, the organized, and the uncanny becomes a kind of way of understanding this larger set of relationships and how these spheres work. So, in one example after another through these chapters that I've just glanced upon, he shows how those people who operate in conjunction with pigeons can bend the pigeons and influence their behavior, at least often, or at least they think they can, and attribute pigeon behavior to things that they are doing. But at the same time, there's an indeterminacy that people do understand, that kind of wildness that makes the pigeons not totally predictable. To me, Colin, in taking this up, is modeling the tension that human beings have between needing order, imposing order, but at the same time enjoying and working through the presence of risk. So there is a kind of, so they do things like make countless, there's connoisseurship, distinctions among types of birds, distinctions among types of breeders, distinctions about different rules of the game, ethics of pigeons and pigeon raising and pigeon racing, and all the other elements. So I think he has something larger on his hands than, again, the pigeons, even the global pigeon. So it's all then happens in the context of sociality that is playing its hand. And so this sociologist of animals is indeed reaching toward the sociology in general. He uses the term hybridity as a way of life to characterize the ways in which human beings are shaped by creatures, other creatures, and the ways in which these creatures are now, since we have reached the end of nature, are themselves a response to human behavior and human beings. Could you hand me my copy, which is a very marked up copy? There's a way in which then this book has implications for our contemporary crisis, the environmental crisis, full stop. And I think it's basically that these creatures are not precious because of biophilia, because they are cute, although that's part of the game and that's part of what's going on. But our social response to nature is what will determine the future of nature and the future of human beings, insofar as, and it is far indeed, we are in interdependence with those natural beings. What Colin helps to show us, I think, is that it will be the specific form of social response to these creatures. Whether they are treated with affection, whether they are understood as in interaction with us, whether they are interfered with in thoughtless ways by government agencies, whether they are fit for our affections, and the political and social movements that follow on that will determine this huge outcome. In other words, the capacity to deal with the environmental crisis depends on this kind of living imagining and the way those imaginings are institutionalized in very specific forms that will determine the degree to which and how it will be that there will be survival. So he did that. So that really is what I have to say, and it's my pleasure to introduce the author himself, Colin.
As my students know, I don't need this. I'll just put that there.
It's hard to hear in the back.
No, it won't be hard. Trust me. I don't really have prepared remarks. The main thing I wanted to do was I told Harvey that I wanted him to do the heavy lifting of talking about what the book was about. My idea was to give some more casual remarks and then read a passage of the book. So I started writing about pigeons in the city as a way to think about how we draw the boundaries between nature and culture in the built environment. And then I would go up on my rooftop in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I lived on top of a doll factory. And I would see around me like 6 or 7 men waving these 20-foot bamboo poles. And then above them would be 600, 700, 800 pigeons. Massive stocks. Actually, in one case, 1,500 pigeons. This guy, Big Frank, was keeping. So, I'm now I started writing about how the city's trying to exterminate pigeons, criminalize pigeon feeding, and then I'm like, what the hell are these guys doing? Here are 6 or 7 guys that I could see from my rooftop with these massive bundles. And so I literally opened up a phone book and said, how do I figure out where to find these guys? There's a pigeon supply store in Bushwick that I can go hang out at and get to meet all the pigeon flyers. And so I started out as an ethnography, I guess you would call it, of a subculture. But the really my favorite thing that I found, and there's a lot of interesting things that I found, was that this was originally an ethnic white, largely Italian, but also Polish-Irish activity in the city that was brought by ethnic white immigrants. But one thing that happened is for those who aged in place in New York City and stayed here while their children moved out to Long Island and Jersey and these neighborhoods turned over and became majority black, majority Hispanic, is that when you fly pigeons, you always have help. Either your son helps you or you hire a neighborhood kid to clean the coop, help you bring the heavy sacks of feed up. And when the other ethnic whites moved out, these folks still needed help. So they actually started paying money to the Puerto Rican and black kids that moved in to help them clean the coops. And then they picked up pigeon flying. And so it took me a while to figure this out, but when I would see this group, I'll just give you an example. I went to the pet shop a couple weeks ago, actually. I hadn't been there in years, but to give them the book because it came out. And there's this guy there, Jojo, who's 89 years old, and he's Italian, he's been flying birds forever. And so he's sitting there and he's spinning all these old yarns about when there used to be like 6 coops on one block of Smith Street. And these young guys come in, black and Hispanic, gold chains, tattoos, gold fronts and all that. And they sit down and they're like listening to Jojo talk and they're like, And then the one guy says to him, he's just like, wait, man, holy shit, are you Jojo? And he's like, yeah, I'm Jojo. And he's like, it's an honor to meet you, man. It's an honor to meet you. And he's like almost literally bowing down. And these are the kinds of fascinating relationships that developed in the interstices of neighborhoods that really, it was a lot of racial conflict that accompanied the changeover of these neighborhoods, right? A lot of racial and ethnic conflict, but this really interesting, and I'm not saying it's common at all, but this really interesting story of this community forming through this animal practice that brings together these very unlikely people. And that's what really compelled me to move forward with this project. And the global part then just came where I was making arguments about place and culture, so then I have to go to other places and other cultures. And so I went to Berlin for a seminar. I wasn't there to do research, but I found these Turkish immigrants keeping pigeons. I found a coop there. And so, of course, I wanted to talk to these guys because I'm writing about guys who keep pigeons. And what was really fascinating was I had this story about sort of cosmopolitan ties and cultural transmission, right, in New York. And here, it was these Turkish immigrants living in tightly knit ethnic communities where they had very little contact and very little interest in contact with the wider German society, if you will, that they were living in. And they would talk about, they were obsessed, they said, these are Turkish birds. In Turkey we've kept these birds for thousands of years. This is an old tradition going back to Anatolian sultans and what have you. And so here it was this animal practice that really was a tangible way for them to carve out Turkish spaces and reinforce ethnocentrism, if you will, and the importance of their own ethnic identity, whereas in New York you have this story about bracketing or transcending ethnocentrism, right, to form these ties. And so that kind of comparison that I did there became the impetus for the wider work that I did. And so if you'll bear with me, I just want to read you a brief passage of one of the pigeon flyers that I was fortunate enough to get to know, Panama. Panama, whose real name is Delroy Sampson, got his nickname from his country of origin. A muscular black man in his 50s with cropped hair, he migrated to a predominantly Italian section of Bushwick when he was a child. He said he spoke no English at the time, but he no longer had a discernible accent and he passed for African American. Panama was smiling, outgoing, and confident. He winked as he boasted about his bird's performance, or the performance of his teenage daughter on her standardized tests. He regularly wore fingerless gloves, a thick gold chain with a medallion, and a bicycle hat. One said Brooklyn on the brim, another said USA. A renter when I met him, in 2006, Panama bought a newly erected townhouse in an up-and-coming, still economically depressed section of Brooklyn known as Broadway Junction, right next to Bushwick, where he grew up. A ceramic decoration of 2 pigeons hung on the front door. Panama was an electrician and had been one for 35 years. In one of my visits to his house, Panama seemed to brim with pride as he showed off his certificate declaring he was a foreman in the local union. And he detailed how he had consolidated his loans, borrowed against the equity of his home to renovate his basement, and saved up to buy a new Chevrolet SUV. But sometimes Panama hinted that his hold on his lifestyle and respectability was precarious. He told me that he had made sure to get 2 copies of his foreman certificate, which he stored in different places, so that he could never be caught without it if someone challenged him. On my first visit to his rooftop, he said unprompted, "I'm trying to do a family thing, not trying to get caught out of position in some bullshit. I'm doing my business, everything is looking good." But Panama accepted the burdens of being black in America and tried to model his behavior accordingly. As images of the star NFL quarterback Michael Vick in handcuffs flashed across the television screen after his arrest for dogfighting, Panama said, "He didn't kill nobody, but he's black." He shrugged his shoulders. "We gotta hold ourselves up to a higher standard." Panama said that he had been inspired to keep pigeons because when he was a kid, he hung out in Bushwick and would see all the older Italian men with their birds. And he started hanging around a homing pigeon club, where there he befriended the president, Joe LaRocco. And Joe convinced Panama's parents that pigeon racing would help keep off the streets. Ever since, Panama grinned, "I've been flying pigeons." After we ascended the ladder to the roof on a warm September morning, he unraveled his crisp, large Panama flag and placed it on the coop. After putting smooth jazz on the radio, which helped drown out the sirens and screeching brakes of the nearby elevated train, Panama opened up the screens, said his 350 or so pigeons could fly out. As they stumbled, he turned to me and said, "My birds fly nice." They say Panama talks a lot of shit at the pet shop, but I back it up. Panama whistled, and this made all the birds take off at one time, their wings clapping together thunderously in unison. See that? I don't even gotta move. I got them on fingertip control. The birds started circling upwards and outwards, and I said, "Wow, they're pretty high already." That ain't nothing. He grabbed the flag and waved it fiercely to make the birds go higher and further. In the evenings, that's when they cut the fuck out. They were gone at 3 o'clock yesterday. Those bitches didn't come back till like 6. They were gone, man. Panama admitted that he lost some birds by rolling out. This is what they call it when they push the birds to fly higher and farther. Man, he caught 2, Joey got 2. Terry dropped 1, couldn't catch it though. His boy over on 88th Street, he caught 7, fine, that's it, that's 11. I tell him, okay, I lost a few birds, you know? They're screaming over some bullshit, but it don't mean nothing to me. Because anybody who rolls out in this area, Panama believe, has got to expect that they're going to lose birds. It was important to Panama that his disciplined pigeon army, as he called it, was the product of his own hands. You got to know what you have. Some of these guys bring in birds from everywhere. Auctions. I'm not adding nothing to this. I'm going to cut out birds. I'm going to make it tighter. I'm going to breed what I already got here that shows the intellect and knowledge. In this way, Panama created what he called a power team, uncorrupted by poor performers and foreign birds. This bloodline became Panama's signature, marking his birds as unique from all other pigeons, and entangling his reputation with his bird's DNA. When other flyers caught Panama's birds, as they surely did, it was as if a minuscule part of Panama himself had been captured. On a daily basis, Panama interacted with other pigeon flyers around him through his birds. He pointed out 3 coops within 5 blocks of his house. Sean flies 600 over there. Oh, there go Luisito putting up his birds. And just then his Nextel walkie-talkie crackled, and it was Sean. "Yo, is that your birds ripping it up there?" Panama laughed. "Mm-hmm, those are mine." Sean said, "Well, I'm waiting for him." After he hung up, Sean pushed up his stock, and we could see his bundle approaching Panama's bundle in the air. They were trying to mix their birds and see if they could steal pigeons off of one another. The phone chirped again. "Yo, it's me, Big Dog, in the house. Send him over so I can catch me a nice one." As we watched other stocks, Panama commented on the flyers just as they were surely sizing him up. "Luisito been flying good." Panama called him, "Louie, I'm watching him fly." "Oh, you're watching mine fly? Well, I got the professor up here." And I told him, your birds are flying pretty good. Did you catch anything? Man, I didn't catch nothing, Luisito responded. This is how Panama passed the hours before and after work, as the birds' interactions in the sky spurred connections with flyers on the ground. Panama had at least 5 coops within a 10-block radius that he could tangle with. And these aerial encounters motivated Panama to always come correct, as he said, with his birds. The worth of his pigeons, and by extension his status amongst the other rooftop flyers, had to be repeatedly demonstrated in the sky. In this way, Panama's pigeons structured his social relationships. He and his neighbors developed routines in which they expected each other to put up their birds and risk losing them. If he were to pass a day without putting up his stock, his peers would get on his case. Panama said he mentored Luisito and returned captured strays that he caught from him, because Luisito was only 19 and was new to flying. He's learning from me now. If my birds mix them, I'm going to give them back. I'm going to keep souping them up so that he'll make the birds fly. But when it came to other flyers, it was a different story. Sean, who flies up there, he got 600. We kill him. He's scared to put up now. My teenage daughter's got him terrorized to put up. He laughed. He's threatening me. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I got 300 birds to his 600. I'm catching 5, 9, 6. I'm up to 37 on that guy now. I asked Panama if he liked the competition, and he grinned like the Cheshire Cat. Yeah, of course I do. I live for the day. I say, I live through it. Thanks.
Are there any ladies up there? I have never seen a woman flying pigeons.
Are there any ladies up there?
Yeah.
There are some. There was one that I knew of in the Lower East Side. Now I hear there's another one that's actually runs in your crew. I haven't met her yet. I don't know if she's here. There you go. So there you go. You know, when it comes to pigeon racing, which I didn't talk about, which is kind of a different thing, top guys, there is a little pocket of women that do it. Now I haven't met any of them that do it that didn't get into it from their husbands. So what happened is they married a pigeon racer. He basically forced her to help him on the roof all the time. So then they just said I might as well actually, you know, become a partner and raise pigeons myself. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is, and this is not surprising actually, but when I ask the guys why it is that women don't do it, they pretty much naturalize it, right? Oh, they don't want to carry these 50-pound sacks of feed up the ladder. It's so dirty and gritty, they don't want to do it. But one of the things that I would see is, I mean, sometimes even in the moment of them saying this, I'd see their son and daughter come up on the roof, curious, going in there, and they'd say like, oh, you know, look at Steve. Steve's got his favorite birds. He knows what to do. And then their daughter, they're like, don't go in there. You're going to step on the eggs. You don't know what you're doing, right? And so they would very much from the time, because this is generally patrilineal, something that fathers at least want to pass on to their son. And I could see the process of them discouraging, you know, their daughters from wanting to do it. And so I talk about how, I mean, the pigeon coop is very much like the street corner, the bar. It's the privileged male space for sociability, and they're going to protect it in that way. So I did meet a few. They're very, very, very much an anomaly. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Mike Tyson still racing pigeons?
As far as so Mike Tyson, for those of you who don't know, has kept pigeons his whole life. He grew up in Brownsville, where he heard about pigeon flying because there were still Italians there flying pigeons. And the story, as he tells it, is that he had a few birds, and one time when he was 10, a teenager killed his best pigeon, and he beat the crap out of the guy. And this is allegedly when he discovered his pugilistic prowess. And he's kept pigeons ever since, and on his last fight, his comeback, which was a disgraceful loss, he said into the camera, "I just want to go back to my birds," which he did. Now, he didn't race pigeons, but for those of you who may be familiar, in 2011, Animal Planet did this mini documentary series called Taking on Tyson, in which the premise was he was going to try out pigeon racing. And so actually my guys who I wrote about in the Bronx, if any of you have seen it, then you've seen some of the guys I write about because they're kind of major protagonists in that. But so the idea was New York is one of the top pigeon racing places in the country, and how's Tyson going to do against New York's best? I actually only saw a couple of them because I don't have cable, but so I don't know how it ends. But he was doing terribly at the ones that I saw. So I don't know if he's still racing, but I know he does still have them. He has a coop in Harlem, and he has a coop in Arizona, which is where he lives full time.
Colin, I want to ask you. It seems that in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been kind of steady emergence of humanists and social scientists and philosophers to sociologists taking seriously questions about humans and animals.
Yes.
And I want to ask you to give us your take on what's drawing so many people into this work, and what are the big questions we need to be asking, and where's the payoff so far?
Good. That's a good question. I mean, I think if you know, to oversimplify it, but this is oversimplification, but it seems to me that it's hard to overstate the impact that Peter Singer's Animal Liberation had, which was very much a moral argument for vegetarianism, but which it was a very serious philosopher writing this book, which of course became a bestseller. And philosophy, at least, has, even though it's still small, at least since that time, has been seriously debating the ethical implications of our relationships with other species. And it seems to me that it kind of emanated out from there. The other major area, which probably to my mind today is taken the most seriously, is animal cognition, which are very, very serious studies about the capacity of primates with language and what have you, which actually dates back around that time as well. I mean, teaching, the experiments with teaching primates sign language. If any of you've seen that movie, what's that movie called? Him? Yeah, that's from like the 70s and 80s, right? Of them trying to this primate living with an animal behaviorist, trying to see if they could teach it language. Because of course, this has implications for the interest there is the evolution from other animals to us, what the discontinuity or continuity is between the species, their capacity for symbolic communication. So then that led to it, I think, being taken more seriously in psychology, where it seems to my mind that the next research, which seems logical, was then, it really came with our the explosion of pets, which have been popular for a long time. And in the past 20, 30 years, pet insurance, pet clothing, pets taking the place of children for some people for at least a longer period of their life as they delay adulthood, or delay having their own families, not all of adulthood, but delay having children, right? So you try out with a dog in your 20s instead of having a kid in your 20s. And so, so then I think psychologists, and really lagging behind them sociologists, started to write about relationships with pets, and because there's issues, it deals with family, it deals with emotional attachment, and so that's kind of how I see the way that it developed. I mean, what I was trying to do with the book, and I kind of critiqued the way that the social science has been, not like the hardcore like brain cognition stuff, but that they had kind of only focused on pets, and that they kind of had really branched out and talked about all the wider, and this gets the answer too of where I think the field is going, or at least should be going, is I kind of said, like, a lot of the stuff that was out there that even write about our relationships with pets or animal domination would say at the end, like, well, now that we know that pets are such a major part of people's lives, and that people will spend as much money on surgery for them as they will for their children, then now we can't eat animals anymore, and we have to. There would kind of be this, like, at the end was the big animal rights statement, and I'm vegan, I'm down with that overall actually, but there was kind of like this disconnect between what they were doing and then saying, and then there would often be this, like, why doesn't anybody pay attention to us? Because this is really important work that we're doing. And what I said in an early critique of this work that I wrote as a kind of arrogant grad student, to be honest, but I said, if you want the rest of sociology or other disciplines to care, then you should just demonstrate that the things they care about are impacted by animals and nature. So show community sociologists that relationships with animals actually have impacts for how we think about community, for how we think about urban space and the built environment, for how we think about identity. And so that's where I think within the social sciences and humanities, the early focus on cognition in pets, I think, is now starting to really get into, I think, the wider implications, and some of which I think gets us to that, where actually at this point there's still this disconnect that I think needs to be broken down between, and that was another thing I'm trying to start doing with the book, is a lot of people that are really involved in either animal studies or animal rights are totally disconnected from people in environmental studies and environmentalism. And to me, human-animal relationships are inextricably linked to civilization-environment relationships, and that I think is the thing that has to be broken down and integrated.
Yeah, one thing would be a comment on the animal-human relationship. I heard from a sociologist that there was a prejudice about people, for example, who had a lot of pets in the 70s, and until the first studies came out how emotionally beneficial it is for human beings to be around pets, because until then it was considered that they lack other interhuman skills and therefore just deal with animals who are easier to dominate or whatever, Yeah. So then the first studies came out, and that apparently had an important influence. But then my other question was, I grew up in the Ruhr district in Germany, a working class area, and all the miners there have pigeons. And people always thought that had a certain poetry, the people are always underground and have the birds fly.
Yeah, do you know that article, Flying Moles, by Soeffner, S-O-E-F-F-N-E-R? It's precisely about
But
that.
I wanted to know whether there are other professions or class distinctions of people like who are tied to that relationship to pigeons in particular.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, if it's like a certain professional group, like miners and a working class group,
I see. Yeah,
that's what I meant.
Do you have a comment?
I think you could expand it some. I was thinking a lot while you were reading that delightful passage about conflicts in a building I was at, that I owned in a co-op building that I owned around beekeeping on the roof. And I was thinking about class codings of that, and the kinds of issues and the arguments that were made, and how that was, in fact, much more tied to the environmental movement. And it's a funny, and it's an animal that most people don't develop emotional attachments to. And so it functions in a different way. So maybe you can put that together, and I'm beginning to think of others where there are very specific class-coded communities and surrogate forms of conflict. And then there was a big conflict in the building with different kinds of arguments that involve issues both of fear and danger and allergy and environmentalism and bringing that into the city. So maybe you can put that together.
Before you do, I think Lily wants to say something on that. Are you on the same thing?
Yes, actually related to our colleague from Germany. Yes, of course, there wouldn't be civilization without animals. And just think, for example, the chevalier, the knight. It's the relationship between a man and a horse that builds a lot of what has come to be known as who we are, certainly in the West.
So these two comments do go together quite nicely, and Judith, that's what the conclusion of the book is about. So I'll give you.
Do I get a discount?
So it's keeping pigeons is a very working class, but even within that, there is this kind of interesting stratification in that the guys who race pigeons in the Bronx, that's more money. So they're buying pedigree birds, they're driving every day to Jersey to release the pigeons to train them. And so here you've got like cops, firemen, steam fitters, sanitation workers, whereas the guys, a lot of the guys, not all of them, but a lot of the guys keeping pigeons, just the rooftop activity I explained here, many fewer of them are union workers. We're now talking about guys with much more contingent labor, $9 to $12 to $15 an hour jobs, the ones that are not nearly as secure. And a lot of the pigeon racers said, when I was a kid, I kept these other birds, and when I got enough of an income that I could race pigeons, I graduated to pigeon racing. Now, what I talk about, which Judith alluded to in the conclusion, is that there is this irony, there's this tension between, there's a simultaneous thing going on right now where there's the greening of cities, right? Whether it's community gardens or beekeeping and chicken keeping and what have you, and this all-out assault against animals that are considered to be nuisance animals and problem pests and nuisance species. And so there's this tension going on all the time. And the poor pigeon flyers, as the neighborhoods are being gentrified, a lot of them are getting kicked out. And people see them and say, "Oh God, flying rats!" And they call inspectors, and you are allowed to keep pigeons, but a lot of them don't. And they're not the fire code. It can be too many. And in the same exact neighborhoods where a lot of these guys are getting kicked off are where the rooftop beehives and chicken coops are popping up. And the poor pigeon flyers are not able to hitch their activity to sustainability, to the green local food movement and all of that. And so, I mean, in Chicago, for instance, where City Hall keeps a beehive on its roof and allows chicken keeping, they made it illegal to keep pigeons. And I talked to the council or the alderman in charge of organizing the ban, and he said, keeping pigeons is so backwards. It's so anachronistic. Who keeps pigeons anymore? But yet, City Hall town is the vanguard because they're keeping, so it's forward-looking to keep bees, and these are very class. So these are the urban homesteaders who tend to be white, upper middle class, and so there very much is a class difference there. Thanks.
Okay, one more round of questions, and then we're going to go. That's my friend. Yeah.
I was just wondering if I really loved how you're kind of talking about how communities are sort of being fostered through this practice and across sort of ethnic divides. And I was wondering if you come across other communities that might have been bringing practice in to New York that was sort of kind of counter to that, and it was a way of sort of maintaining boundaries in some ways. Because I started to do some research on Pakistani pigeon breeders, and from my conversations with them, they live in Midwood and Brooklyn, they seem to not be participating in the same kind of sociology that you were describing, so I wondered if you had
Right.
Before you do that.
Sure. Oh yeah. Should we
Any more
just
questions?
take a last
Take
round
one
and
last
I'll try to.
Yeah, double dipping. Go ahead.
What's next for you? Are you writing another book?
Do you have a question about what you're doing next?
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay.
Okay. These can be brief. So yeah, I mean, so because I focused on particular places, and it was either a black Hispanic or a black white, or white Hispanic, white black transition of neighborhoods, right? So that was in New York, that was the phenomenon that I focused on, was particular neighborhoods where those were the groups that I found. When I just went to the pet shop a couple weeks ago, Joey, the owner, said I hung out there for a couple hours, and these Turkish guys came in, and he's like, oh, there's some Turks, you should talk to them. And it was funny because I had never seen any come in while I was there, and so so the place that they used to get their supplies from is closed. This is not surprising because they're not going. So now they come here, but so I was always aware that there were probably other people that that were doing it that were not part of this integration, if you will. And I think so. I don't answer that question directly in the book, except to say I imagine that they fit the mold of what I wound up writing about the Turkish immigrants in Berlin. So they weren't. Because they weren't at this nexus where when the neighborhood was changing over, they got it from. Because the important thing is the blacks and Hispanics, interesting, they were not keeping them before. So as kids, they got it from the ethnic whites. But if they were already doing it, then it could have been different. But yeah. So I think that I would hope that the chapter, if you read the book, if you buy and read the book, the Turkish immigrant chapter, I think even though it's about Berlin, it will kind of get to that question. As far as the other one, I'm living in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the home of Little League Baseball World Series, right? Doing an ethnography of how fracking, natural gas extraction, has impacted community life there. And so I've been there for 3 months. I've got 5 more, and that's the next project.
I can guarantee you we get an even bigger crowd when you're fracking. So Harvey, thank you for doing this, and Colin, congratulations.
Thank you.